Hi everybody, welcome to Fresh Outlook, the show where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm your host Taryn Brill, but just call me TWB. On today's show, we'll begin by discussing the latest on the situation in Syria. The death toll is now 70,000, and President Obama says more evidence is needed of chemical weapons use. We'll tackle the topic and what's at stake. Then we'll get into the situation in Guantanamo Bay at the naval base. The president says he's renewing efforts to shut it down. But what are the options? We'll discuss it. And from there, it's been 6 months since Hurricane Sandy. So what's the current situation in the hardest hit areas? That's ahead. But before we get the conversation started, as always, let's meet this week's all-star panel. Let's begin with a familiar face. Bart, tell us who you are and where you're from.
I'm Bart Rossi, a political psychologist, taking a look at the psychology and political psychology of the event.
Terrific. You always do a great job. Curious your insights this
Thank
week.
you.
A new face, Scott, welcome. Tell us who you are and where you're from.
Thank you. I'm Scott Monje. I'm a senior editor of the Encyclopedia Americana and contributor to foreignpolicyblogs.com at the Foreign Policy Association.
Welcome, welcome. And Dee Dee.
I'm a political and cultural commentator, former aide to President Bush, and a blogger.
Terrific. Looking forward to getting the conversation started. But first, the situation, as we know, is deadly in Syria, with casualties up to 70,000 that we know of. Let's take a look.
U.S. intelligence has concluded that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons twice on its people.
The U.S. intelligence community assesses with some degree of varying confidence that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons on a small scale in Syria, specifically the chemical agent sarin.
Officials say more definitive proof is needed, and the U.S. is not ready to escalate its involvement.
What we now have is evidence that chemical weapons have been used inside of Syria, but we don't know how they were used, when they were used, who used them. We don't have a chain of custody that establishes what exactly happened. And when I am making decisions about America's national security and the potential for taking additional action in response to chemical weapon use, I've got to make sure I've got the facts.
The White House disclosed the new intelligence in letters to 2 senators and the defense secretary.
The situation in Syria is unacceptable. The President of the United States said that this would be a red line if they used chemical weapons.
The White House said that the Syrian regime used sarin gas on both occasions. Sarin is an odorless nerve agent that poisons people when they breathe it, absorb it, or ingest it. The Syrian government has so far refused to allow the UN experts to investigate the use of gas.
All right, so panel, what do you make of this? I mean, we kept hearing about this red line, waiting for this red line to be crossed. Senator McCain says there's no doubt that a red line has been crossed, yet the administration seems to be hesitating. Where do we stand? Let's start. Who wants to start it off? Scott?
Yes, well, Senator McCain has made the argument that dealing with credibility of the United States, including credibility towards other countries such as Iran and North Korea, that if you make a threat, if you do X, we will respond in this way, and don't follow through on it, that will undermine the credibility in future cases. It is a valid argument, but also it overlooks other aspects since it's not entirely clear what's going on. If you make a threat, if you do X, we'll follow through, and you follow through when they have not done X, it begins to look like some sort of setup.
But wasn't there a letter that came out that McCain has quoted, say the administration said, there was a letter that came out saying that there's a varying degree of confidence based on physiological samples of chemical weapons use. So if we have these samples, what's the hesitation? What's the holdup here? They
have, I believe, physiological samples from 2 people who've been exposed to sarin. Now, if you look at the earlier instance in the 1990s in Halabja in Iraq, there were thousands of people who died and thousands of people who were sickened by this. People began showing up in hospitals with sarin symptoms in countries other than Iraq. There was no question that it had happened. 2 people being exposed to sarin could be the result of something else. If you look at the incentive structure here, the Syrian government does not want the United States to intervene. Clearly, the rebels, at least some of them, do, if not directly.
No,
then
of course Syria doesn't want us to intervene, but
certainly.
But,
and so
yeah,
President Obama then makes this statement, somewhat vague but fairly clear, that if they cross this line, if they use chemical agents, then the U.S. will do something about it. Well, and then the rebels start saying, hey, they've started using chemical agents, and here's some vague but not entirely clear evidence. You want to make
I mean,
sure
that's
that they've really done it.
Vague,
Otherwise,
but not entirely
what
clear.
message does North Korea or Iran take from it if it turns out to be another mistake? Say, and we have the example of Iraq right behind us. Say we once again go ahead,
Right. So you think
get
that's
involved,
Obama's
and then
hesitation?
and then find out that it didn't happen. The lesson that they will take out of that is that the United States makes these threats, and then they say, "Oh, you did it. We're going to invade you."
Right.
Whether you did it or not. Clearly, the United States, they will say, doesn't mean it. They're just looking for an excuse to invade you, and we don't have to worry about getting rid of our nuclear programs or anything, because it's not going to stop
So based
them
on
from
that,
doing
should
what they wanna
Obama
do.
never have talked about that red line threat? What do you think,
Yeah,
Dee Dee?
he set himself up for that. He said, you know, this is the red line. Here, we've got the evidence now. He's the one who did it. So, you know, when he throws down the gauntlet and then he doesn't do anything about it, it makes us look weak. And it's very hurtful to our friends in the Middle East. Obviously, Turkey, Jordan, and Israel. So this is not good. So, you know, I think it's time for him to, you know, put up or shut up. I mean, it's time for him to move forward because he's the one who set up the parameters.
Okay, well, the question is, do we have the capabilities to move forward?
Well, I actually agree with Dee Dee on this one, because I think that anytime you get into this red line stuff, it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
We did it with Israel. We're talking about red lines in the sand. It's not good politically, psychologically. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But I also would like to add that what bothers me is the people involved with the rebels. We don't know who they are. They're different factions, different personality types, different terrorists, who's aligned with the Al-Qaeda group. So how do you arm anyone?
Right.
I really differ with the Senator McCain. I mean, he says we should do something, and Lindsey Graham and all the others say we should do something. But how do you arm people and you don't even know who they are?
Okay.
It doesn't make any sense
So
to me.
the greater question is, why is it always the U.S. feeling obliged to get involved? Should this not be a UN issue, an international community issue? So all the pressure isn't just on us. What do you think, Scott?
Well, it ought to be, and the U.S. is trying to get the involvement of the United Nations and, if possible, the Arab League in on this. It's very difficult to do, in particular because the Russians at the United Nations are opposed to taking action against the Assad regime, and they have a veto in the Security Council, so they can stop UN action from occurring.
Okay. I mean, but
They may be brought around to some sort of action.
okay. But Israel, Britain, France, they all agree that a red line has been crossed. How come, what, are they all just waiting for us? Dee Dee, what do you think?
Well, you know, United States has a rich history of being a leader, of trying to be helpful, and now we are giving humanitarian efforts, so that's important, as well as we're bolstering the borders for our friends, so that part is good. But, you know, I think it's a good thing. I think our country is, you know, a leader in this regard and trying to be helpful. And, you know, there are 70,000 deaths and 1.2 million refugees, so it's a dire situation, so something needs to be done. And again, President Obama said this is a red line, so I think we have to cross it.
Right. I mean, are we capable of handling another war? Can we afford it? Do we have sufficient capability to go in at this point?
No,
Okay.
I don't think we can afford going to war, and I agree with what Dee Dee just said, but that doesn't answer the question in terms of what do you then do? Because I think the problem is too complex, and psychologically, emotionally, Americans aren't ready to go into action.
What do we think Americans? I mean, do Americans really know what's going on in Syria? I mean, are they abreast of the situation? Do they care?
About a third. What's that? About a third, and they may know only part. You know, and it's and we don't even know everything because, you know, it's a military action. I mean, we're not going to know everything, and they won't. Even Syria won't even let the UN go in and search for the chemical weapons. So, you know, if they don't have them, what's the problem? Why won't they let the search go on? And to what you said, Dr. Rossi, about you know, arming the rebels, that's the first step. I mean, that's like us not having boots on the ground. I mean, that's plan B. And a lot of Americans perhaps would prefer that, but it is dangerous because we don't know what they'll do. We don't know if Hezbollah, we don't know if they're the enemy, so it's very tricky.
Very tricky. Scott, what do you think about going to war? Can we afford it?
I think there's a lot of assumption when people talk about going in, that we're going to go in and stop this situation. Many people have been killed. If we go in, that will end. Well, keep in mind again that there are PowerPoint presentations made back in 2003 to convince President Bush that the troops would be home by Christmas in 2003, and it didn't turn out that way. And this also is not simply a matter of removing a dictator. I think many people tend to see these dictatorships as one guy here with a few paid cronies around him and the population united against him. And in fact, the dictator in many situations has a social base, and this one has a social base. It's a minority base, and that's why he has to be a dictator if he wants to run. But it's a very strong base in the Alawite community, which is apprehensive of the possibility of the Sunnis taking over because they have a long history of, in their view, being oppressed by the Sunni majority. And since they're afraid of the majority, they don't want a democracy. And since they're afraid of retribution from the majority of the population, they don't want Assad to leave. Even if he decides to leave, they don't want him to go.
Right.
And if he does leave, they're going to replace him with somebody else. And the fighting in some form is very likely to continue on for quite some time.
In your opinion, if we did go in, would that make things worse?
As Dee Dee pointed out, it's very bad right now, but it could get worse. For instance, we have evidence of 2 people being gassed by sarin. Well, what if he really uses the sarin gas once? You know, if he's hesitating now because we're not going in, if we go in, he has no reason to withhold it anymore. And he could start gassing cities at random. 70,000 people is a horrendous number, and yet there are other conflicts around the world that get absolutely no attention whatsoever. Darfur gets some with 300,000 people killed. South Sudan had 2 million people killed. 5 million people have died in Congo.
Why aren't those at the forefront?
I don't know.
Why don't we talk about that?
I don't know.
Yeah, and when it comes to leadership, you know, that really floors me as a psychologist. I mean, we're supposed to be the leader of the world, but how do we lead a world when it's so confusing and so complex?
Right.
Unless we get other nations involved in this conflict and support a change, then I don't think we can be a leader.
But that's what we're trying to do, though. I mean, that's the first step. Instead of boots on the ground, trying to, you know, our friends, you know,
mobilizing the international community.
Absolutely.
But I don't think that's going to, I mean, do you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, well, it's happened many
Things seem to be in a
times.
stall right now, though, regarding this situation. Everyone's waiting for us to make the first
And you're
chess
right
move.
about that, and that's why, you know, everyone's watching what President Obama is going to do because of the red line comment, and then with the proof, and then now what? So it's a trying time, but we really do need to have the support of our friends in that area. And the Middle East, obviously, is always very difficult. So I think that's why there's a lot of tension on. And of course, chemical weapons. It's just awful, and that's sort of an, you know, an area where people just don't want to see
chemical weapons.
I don't know.
I mean, right. But why
We'll
is
see.
the international community waiting? Why won't anybody do something?
Nobody wants to do anything. Nobody wants to step up to the plate. They don't want to take any risks. As Dee Dee said, it's a tricky situation. Do you really want to get involved in a tricky situation
why should we?
politically?
And we've
That's
just
right.
had
Why should we?
Afghanistan and Iraq.
Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
And we've just had Afghanistan and Iraq, and as Dr. Rossi
Yeah,
said,
but that doesn't mean that you don't
people
go in. I mean, these are people that are dying, and,
Well,
and he's a monster. I mean, and I think it's good that our country wants to take leadership, and that other countries are looking at our country saying, you know what, we appreciate that. I'm sure those folks that are dying and suffering now would really appreciate our help, and the neighbors around. And of course, for the Middle East, to try to stay as peaceful as possible, because Syria is making the Middle East very dangerous right now.
So, Dee Dee, if you were president, Madam
I'd go
President,
in. I'd
you'd go
cross
in
the red
how?
line right now.
What would you do exactly? I mean, what would you do in terms of provision of weapons? Would you establish a safe zone? What would be your method?
Look, I mean, I'm very, very much a pro-U.S. Let's go in and help people that need to be helped. I think that's a good thing to do. So I think, you know, whatever it takes. I would go boots on the ground, actually. I mean, I would.
Really?
Instead
See,
of.
I am way on the other side.
I know, I understand that.
I am way on the other
Okay,
side.
what do
this
you,
way.
or drones
Because
or whatever we've got to do. I mean,
think this
somehow
has-
to make something happen.
I'm completely on the other side of this because I think we should be as cautious as the president is seemingly cautious.
Well, I don't think it's very cautious to say if we cross the red line and then
Well,
there's
that was a
proof.
mistake.
And
I
Then you
think
have
that- I
to
think that's a
establish that
mistake.
there is a red line. It's not a mistake at this point. It could still happen that evidence of a major sarin attack comes out, and in that case, then he'll have a decision.
And even
to make.
without that, the
But to
people
make
that are
the decision
dying
at
and
this point-
suffering, you know, something needs to be done for these
But
people.
the dying and suffering is one issue. Putting boots on the ground
Right.
and intervening when we don't even know who the rebels are, and some of them are Al Qaeda.
Well,
people.
we're already starting to put, we
Right.
have like 200 soldiers at this point. I mean, who knows
Right.
what's going on now, but we're already starting to intervene.
Okay. All right, guys, we got to wrap up. Final thoughts, Scott, real quickly. Final word on the topic.
I would be extremely cautious about going in. I don't think I would go in boots on the ground. If evidence of a large gas attack has come through, I might consider assaults on air bases or something like that, since they've been relying heavily on air bases to bomb civilian populations.
How much evidence do we need, though, to say a red line's been crossed?
Something, it's the old Potter theory, we'll know it when we see it, I suppose, but
Okay.
it's got to be more than evidence of a couple people exposed to sarin. U.S. troops were exposed to sarin in the first Iraq War in '91. as a result of blowing up Iraqi arms ammunition depots after the war. They accidentally gassed themselves. So it can happen that small numbers of people get exposed to sarin gas without there having been an attack.
All right, guys, thank you for your insight. We got to move on to the next topic and take a break. Coming up on Fresh Outlook, the latest in Guantanamo Bay. That's next. Stay with us. You're watching Fresh Outlook.